The moment she snapped her fingers for the waiter and told him to remove this pauper from the table, I realized my son would never defend me. The clinking of wine glasses stopped. Conversations froze. Every pair of eyes at that luxury hotel's dining hall turned to me, the older woman with short white hair and glasses sitting at the end of the long table holding back tears. I had only come because my son had invited me to his birthday dinner. I wore my best dress, a simple navy one Peter had given me years ago. I didn't have diamonds or designer handbags like the others at the table, but I thought I had love. I thought that would be enough. I didn't know the woman my son married would humiliate me in front of strangers. I didn't know she would treat me like a stain on her perfect evening. This is my story. I'm Catherine. And today, you'll hear what happened after that dinner and why it changed everything. Welcome to Catherine Stories, where every story is real, raw, and full of heart. Before we dive deeper, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It means the world to know where these stories reach, and it helps this video find others who need it. Let's begin. It started subtly that night. My daughter-in-law, Melissa, didn't greet me when I arrived. She didn't even walk toward me. She just sat there in her sleeveless designer gown, her posture perfect, her diamond earrings catching the light as if they were meant to blind me from a distance. When our eyes met, she gave me a tight, polite smile that didn't touch her eyes. Then, without missing a beat, she leaned toward the woman sitting beside her, a tall, thin lady in a glittering silver dress, and whispered something. I saw their shoulders shake with laughter. I didn't know if it was about me, but my chest tightened all the same. I smoothed down the front of my navy dress, the one Peter had given me on our 25th anniversary, and tried to ignore the way their eyes flicked in my direction before they laughed again. The table was enormous, set for at least 20 people, the kind of setup you see in luxury hotel brochures: gold-plated cutlery, crystal wine glasses, candles flickering in silver holders. The seats near the center, the ones closest to my son, were taken by Melissa's friends, her family, and a few of my son's colleagues. I had been placed all the way at the far end. I told myself it was fine. At least I was here. I thought maybe later in the evening my son would come over, sit beside me, make sure I was comfortable. But as I looked down the long table, I saw him laughing with Melissa's friends, clinking glasses, his hand resting on her chair. The first hour felt lonely. Every time I tried to speak, someone would talk over me. If I asked a question, the answer was short, and then the conversation flowed past me like a river skirting around a rock. Melissa's friends were in their element. They compared vacation homes in Italy, spoke about their people who booked private jets, and casually discussed luxury handbags that cost more than I'd made in 6 months. I stayed quiet, smiling politely, sipping my water. I didn't belong in that conversation, and they made sure I felt it. The waiter came to refill my glass. I noticed he gave me a small, almost apologetic smile, like he could sense the invisible wall they'd built around me. Then the main course arrived, beautifully plated lobster tail glistening under the light. The smell was rich, buttery, almost too much. I had never ordered lobster in my life. That's when Melissa turned her head toward me, her voice sweet but sharp. "Oh, I forgot. Catherine doesn't do expensive meals, right?" Her words cut through the clinking of cutlery like a blade. A few people chuckled, not loudly, but enough. Enough for me to feel the burn rise in my cheeks. I forced a smile. "I'm sure it will be lovely," I said softly, though my voice barely carried over the hum of the room. Inside, my heart stung. I knew she was making a point, reminding everyone that I came from a different world, that I didn't have their wealth or their polished manners. I picked up my fork slowly, determined not to let her see my hurt. A few minutes later, they brought out the birthday cake, a towering, elegant creation with golden sugar flowers and layers of rich cream. My son stood at the center, smiling as everyone sang. I pulled out my phone, my modest little phone with a cracked corner, to take a photo. I just wanted to capture the moment, to have something to remember the evening by. Melissa noticed instantly. She leaned toward me, her perfume strong and suffocating, and hissed under her breath, "Put that away. This isn't some cheap diner birthday. You're embarrassing him." I froze. My fingers tightened around my phone. Embarrassing him? I raised him. I fed him when I skipped meals. I bought him new shoes by wearing the same winter coat for years. I stayed awake at night sewing his school. Costumes, selling homemade pies just to afford his college textbooks. And now, I was the embarrassment. I put my phone down slowly, staring at the tablecloth so no one could see my eyes glisten. I took a deep breath and tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but the evening didn't stop there. After the cake was served, Melissa's uncle, a tall, imposing man with a deep voice, began telling stories about real class and knowing how to behave in refined settings. Though he didn't say my name, I felt every word aimed like a dart toward me. Melissa kept flashing him approving smiles. At one point, someone asked me where I lived. When I told them about my small home, the same one Peter and I bought decades ago, a young woman at the table raised her eyebrows. "Oh, that must be cozy," she said, in a tone dripping with false sweetness. Cozy. The way she said it, she might as well have said pathetic. I excused myself to the restroom, my legs trembling as I walked. Inside, I stood before the mirror, gripping the edge of the marble sink. I told myself to breathe, to hold it together. I dabbed at my eyes, careful not to ruin my makeup. When I returned, the conversations had moved on. They were discussing a charity gala. Melissa mentioned they were buying a table for family. And then, without looking at me, she added, "Well, most of the family." Laughter rippled through the table. I sat down quietly, my appetite gone. The lobster on my plate was cold now, untouched. The room felt smaller, the voices louder, the air heavier. I could feel Melissa's eyes on me every so often, like she was waiting for me to say something, to make a scene she could later blame on me. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I stayed silent. But inside, a storm was building. Because as much as I wanted to pretend I didn't care, I did. I cared that my son hadn't once looked down the table to check on me. I cared that he let her words, her digs, her humiliation go unchecked. I cared that after everything I had sacrificed for him, I was now just a guest in his life. A guest they clearly wished hadn't come. That night was supposed to be about him, about celebrating his birthday. But for me, it became the night I began to see the truth. The truth that Melissa wasn't just cold or unfriendly. She wanted me out of the picture entirely. She wanted to rewrite my place in my son's life, and she was doing it one public humiliation at a time. And worse, my son was letting her. I didn't know it yet, but this dinner would be the start of something I could never undo. The beginning of a distance between us that would grow far wider than that long, elegant table. The breaking point came suddenly, though in hindsight, I could feel it brewing for hours. Every subtle jab, every calculated humiliation. Melissa's wealthy uncle, a tall man with a commanding voice and the kind of presence that demanded attention, stood up, glass in hand. His gold cufflinks caught the light as he tapped his glass gently, silencing the table. "I just want to take a moment," he began, his tone deep and deliberate, "to acknowledge what a remarkable woman Melissa is. Since she married into this family, she has, well, elevated it." The room murmured approvingly. I glanced toward my son, hoping he'd frown, maybe even correct the implication that Melissa had somehow lifted us. But instead, he smiled, his arm sliding around her waist as if to say, "Yes, that's true." My stomach twisted. Elevated? As though we were beneath her? Melissa beamed, placing her perfectly manicured hand over her uncle's. "Thank you, Uncle Charles. We've been working so hard to refine things." Then her eyes found mine, and there it was. The moment. Her lips curled into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "And of course," she said, her voice deliberately louder now so the entire table could hear, "we're trying to keep our image, which is why some people need to understand this isn't their scene." The table fell silent. Utensils hovered mid-air. Someone coughed uncomfortably. I felt the blood drain from my face. My ears rang. The words seemed to echo inside my head over and over until I could barely hear the muted clinking of glasses. "Melissa?" I began, my voice trembling but firm. She didn't let me finish. Her chin lifted slightly, her eyes sharp, and she turned to the waiter who had been quietly pouring wine a few seats down. "Could you please have security escort this lady out?" She gestured toward me with a dismissive flick of her hand, as if I were some stranger who had stumbled into the wrong room. "She's clearly uncomfortable here." Then, as if twisting the knife, she added with a smirk, "It's for your own good, Catherine." The words hit me harder than any physical slap could have. I looked at my son. I searched his face, waiting, praying May for him to speak, to say, "No, Melissa, that's my mother. She stays." But he didn't move. He didn't say a word. His arms stayed wrapped around her, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth, as if avoiding my eyes would make him invisible in this moment. The waiter hesitated, his eyes darting between us. I could see the discomfort written across his face, the slight frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. But Melissa's glare was sharper than any knife, and she didn't need to raise her voice to command compliance. Slowly, I pushed back my chair. The sound of the legs scraping against the marble floor seemed deafening in the silence. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand there and demand answers, to ask my son if this was truly the man I had raised, the boy whose scraped knees I'd kissed, whose tears I'd wiped away. And the middle of the night, I wanted to tell him about the winters I went without heat so he could have new school shoes, about the years I worked 2 jobs so he could go to college without debt. But my throat closed around the words. If I spoke, I feared my voice would break. And I refused to give Melissa the satisfaction of seeing me crumble in front of her friends, her family, her audience. So I stood, smoothing my dress, lifting my chin. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. As I walked toward the exit, I caught snippets of whispers. Someone muttered, "That was uncalled for." Another voice, maybe Melissa's friend, said, "Well, she doesn't exactly fit in here." Each step felt heavier than the last. I passed the line of waiters standing near the kitchen entrance. One of them, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, met my eyes and gave me the faintest nod, like a silent, "I'm sorry." The massive dining room doors loomed ahead. When I reached them, I paused. For one last second, I turned, not to look at Melissa, but at my son. He still hadn't moved. His shoulders were hunched slightly, his gaze fixed on the floor, his hand still on her chair. And that was what broke me. Not her cruelty, not the humiliation, not even the smug satisfaction in her eyes, but his silence, his choice to say nothing. I pushed the doors open and stepped into the hotel's long, dimly lit corridor. The sound of laughter from the dining room faded behind me, replaced by the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the muffled footsteps of hotel staff. Halfway down the hall, my vision blurred. I blinked hard, willing the tears back, but they came anyway, hot and unstoppable. I felt them streak down my cheeks, ruining the makeup I'd so carefully applied earlier. I didn't run. I didn't rush. I walked slowly, each step deliberate. My heels clicked unit. D against the polished floor, echoing in the empty space. A security guard, a tall man with kind eyes, appeared at the far end of the hall. He didn't approach aggressively, just walked alongside me toward the lobby. "Ma'am," he said gently, "do you need help finding your car?" I shook my head. "No, I know the way." My voice was calm, steady, even though inside I was breaking. When we reached the lobby, I glanced back once, half hoping to see my son chasing after me, calling my name, telling me not to go. But the corridor was empty. I stepped out into the cool night air. The city lights blurred with my tears, turning the streets into shimmering rivers of gold. Cars rushed by, their headlights slicing through the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, music played from an open window, lively and joyful, a sharp contrast to the heaviness in my chest. I walked to the bus stop instead of calling a cab. I didn't want to sit in the back seat of a stranger's car, making polite conversation while my heart was in pieces. I needed air. I needed time to breathe before I went home to an empty kitchen and the photo of Peter on the wall. As I sat on the cold metal bench, I thought about every moment that had led to this night. Every smile I'd given Melissa when she first joined our family. Every gift I'd picked out for her birthdays. Every time I'd bitten my tongue when her words were sharp. I thought about the first time I met her. How my son had looked at her like she hung the moon. I had wanted to love her. For his sake. I had tried. And now, here I was, sitting alone at a bus stop while they toasted her inside a glittering dining room. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes, the doors folding open like tired arms. I stepped inside, swiped my fare, and found a seat by the window. As the city passed by in blurs of neon and shadow, I whispered to myself, "This will be the last time. The last time I allowed her to humiliate me. The last time I put myself in a room where my worth was measured in designer labels and bank balances. The last time I would sit quietly while my son chose her silence over my dignity." By the time I reached my stop, I wasn't just heartbroken. I was certain. Melissa had drawn the battle lines, and my son had stood on her side. That night, I went home and sat in my quiet kitchen. The house felt colder than usual, as though the humiliation from that dinner had followed me inside and settled into the walls. I didn't even take my coat off right away. I just dropped my purse on the counter and sat at the small wooden table Peter had built decades ago. My eyes drifted to the photo hanging above the sideboard, the one of Peter holding a basket of tomatoes from our garden, his smile so wide it could light up the whole room. "You wouldn't believe what our boy let happen," I whispered into the stillness. My voice caught on the last word, and I pressed my lips together to keep it from trembling. The kettle on the stove caught my eye, but I didn't move. I didn't want tea. I didn't want food. I wanted my son to be the man I thought he was, and tonight, he wasn't. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the dinner. The way Melissa's eyes glinted when she spoke. The way my son's gaze stayed fixed on the tablecloth. The scrape of my chair against the marble floor. It played over and over like a cruel film I couldn't turn off. For 2 days, I didn't answer my phone. The screen would light up with my son's name, and I'd watch it ring until it stopped. Not out of spite, but because I knew that if I heard his voice too soon, I might forgive him before I was ready. I needed space, not just from Melissa, but from the version of my son who had sat there and let her dismantle my dignity without lifting a finger. I didn't want to sit in that pain forever, though, so I turned my attention to the one place I always felt needed and valued, the community center. I'd been volunteering there for years, teaching free cooking classes for single mothers on Thursdays, helping with the after-school homework program twice a week. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. People looked me in the eye there. They smiled at me without an agenda. The first morning back, the smell of fresh bread baking in the center's kitchen wrapped around me like a hug. I tied on my apron, set out the mixing bowls, and greeted the women as they came in. Women whose hands were rough from work, whose eyes were tired but warm. "Today we're making shepherd's pie," I announced, clapping my hands together. "It's simple, it's filling, and it tastes like home." We peeled potatoes and shared stories. One woman talked about her little boy losing his first tooth. Another laughed about burning rice 3 nights in a row. They teased each other, helped each other, passed ingredients across the table without being asked. And for a few hours, I forgot about the long table at that luxury hotel. I forgot about Melissa's voice and my son's silence. All that mattered was the bubbling pans, the smell of baked crust, and the laughter that spilled into the kitchen like sunlight. When the pies came out of the oven, the women insisted I take one home. I protested, but they wouldn't hear it. "Family feeds family," one of them said with a grin. The next day, during the after-school program, I helped a group of children build cardboard castles. They showed me their crooked towers with such pride, it made my chest ache in the best way. One little boy, no older than 7, handed me a paper crown he'd made out of yellow construction paper. "You're the queen," he declared. I laughed, placing it on my head. "The queen of what?" He thought for a moment. Of nice people. It was such a simple thing, a child's logic, but it lodged itself deep in my heart. Days turned into weeks. My phone rang less often, and when it did, I didn't feel the same urgency to answer. I kept myself busy with the center, my garden, my book club. And little by little, the heavy knot in my chest loosened. I began to remember who I was before Melissa's words tried to shrink me, before my son's silence made me feel invisible. One chilly afternoon, I was in the community center kitchen again, slicing apples for a pie, when one of the young mothers, a woman named Denise, walked in carrying a small plate. On it was a slice of chocolate cake, rich and glossy. She set it down in front of me. "For you," she said. "Oh, I can't take your cake," I protested. Her eyes softened. "You're like family to us, Catherine. Family gets cake." It was such a simple sentence, but my throat tightened all the same. I realized that in this little corner of the city, in a building with peeling paint and mismatched chairs, I was seen, I was valued, I was loved. For the first time in weeks, I smiled without forcing it. That night, as I sat in my kitchen again, the same photo of Peter smiling down at me, I thought about the word family. How it isn't always about blood. Sometimes family is the people who stand beside you when others turn away. And for the first time since that dinner, I didn't feel quite so alone. I wasn't healed completely. Wounds like that don't disappear overnight, but I had a sense of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Strength. Because maybe I couldn't change my son's choices. Maybe I couldn't change Melissa's cruelty, but I could choose who I gave my time, my energy, and my heart to. And I could choose to keep my head high, even if my seat at their table was gone forever. 3 months later, there was a knock at my door. It was early evening, the sun already low, casting long shadows across my garden. I wiped my hands on a dish towel as I walked to the door, my mind assuming it was a neighbor or one of the women from the community center. But when I opened it, my breath caught. My son stood there. His hair was messy, like he'd been running his hands through it for hours. His eyes looked tired, rimmed red, not from lack of sleep alone, but from something heavier. "Mom," his voice cracked just enough for me to hear the weight in it. Melissa left. I didn't speak. I just held the door frame and waited for him to go on. "She took the money," he said, his voice flat, almost numb. "The car. Everything. The bank accounts are empty. He swallowed hard. "I should have stopped her that night at the dinner. I should have protected you." I looked at him for a long time, letting the silence stretch between us. The wind outside whistled softly through the trees. "You didn't," I said simply. Not with anger, not with cruelty, just with the truth. His eyes glistened. "I was scared of losing her," he admitted. "But I lost you instead." That sentence landed heavier than he probably knew. I felt something in me shift. Part of me wanted to pull him into my arms, to forgive him right there, to erase the hurt. But another part, the part that had stood up from that table and walked away with my head high, needed more time. "I don't hate you," I said, my voice steady. "But love needs respect. Without it, it's nothing." He nodded, his shoulders slumping under the weight of regret. "Can I come in?" I hesitated for a moment. The memories of that night flashed like photographs in my mind. Melissa's smirk, the cold silence of the table, my son looking down instead of standing up. Finally, I opened the door. Just a little. "For a cup of tea," I said. He stepped inside slowly, like he wasn't sure if the floor beneath him would hold. I put the kettle on, the whistle filling the room a few minutes later, the familiar sound oddly comforting in the awkward quiet. We sat at my small kitchen table, the same one where he'd done his homework as a boy, where Peter used to read the newspaper every morning. He stared at his hands, twisting them together like he was searching for the right words. "She said I had to choose," he murmured finally. "Her or you, and I chose her. I thought it was love, but it was control. It was all about how things looked, not how they felt." I stirred sugar into my tea slowly. "Looks fade," I said softly, "but the way you treat people, that's what stays." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I don't expect you to forgive me tonight. I want to try. I want to be your son again." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the boy who used to pick wildflowers for me in the summer, the teenager who shyly asked me for advice before his first date, the young man who cried on my shoulder when Peter died. I also saw the man who had sat in silence while his wife humiliated me. Both versions of him lived in front of me now. "Trying," I said quietly, "means showing up. Not just when you've lost something, but when you still have it." He blinked quickly, but a tear slipped down his cheek anyway. "I'll show up," he promised. We didn't hug, not yet, but we sipped our tea in silence, and in that silence, there was possibility. As the night deepened and he finally left, I stood by the window watching him walk to his car. He glanced back once, and for the first time in months, our eyes met without anger or shame. After he drove away, I sat back at the kitchen table. My tea had gone cold, but I didn't care. I thought about everything I'd learned in those 3 months, that people can take your seat at a fancy dinner, they can strip away your place in their world, they can make you feel like you don't belong, but they can't take your worth. They can't erase the love and dignity you carry in your own heart, and that is worth more than any table I'll ever sit at. Because sometimes, the real table, the one that matters, is the small one in your own kitchen, where the tea is warm, the air is gentle, and the only people sitting there are the ones who truly see you. Thanks for watching. Subscribe this channel and share this video. See you in next video. God bless us.